Georgia is hemmed in by Iran's enemies. Its closest regional partner is Azerbaijan, the country Iran hit with drones this March. Its fastest growing security relationship is with Israel, Iran's sworn enemy. And for 30 years, it has courted the United States, the government Tehran considers its greatest adversary on earth. Georgia sits on the edge of a region Iran treats as its own historical backyard, ringed by the very partners Iran fears most. By every rule of geopolitics, Tbilisi and Tehran should be adversaries. They're not. For 3 decades, through revolutions, wars, and sanctions, Georgia and Iran have kept a functional relationship alive. Iran was one of the first countries to recognize Georgian independence, shipped emergency gas to keep Georgia's lights on during a winter energy crisis. There's even a name for the arrangement in the diplomatic files: cold friendly. But lately, you've been told that relationship is turning into something more, that a former American ally is slipping into Iran's orbit, op-eds in the Washington Post, studies out of Washington think tanks, a whole narrative that Georgia is drifting into Tehran's arms. That narrative is wrong. Not because Iranian influence in Georgia isn't real, it is, but because it mistakes a hard ceiling for a slide. I'm Bruce Pannier. I've spent 4 decades covering the former Soviet Union. This is Turan Research Center, hosted by the Yorktown Institute, where we break down the geopolitics of Turkey, Iran, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. If you're new here and want more analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. And now, let's get into it. To understand the ceiling, you first have to understand the thing that governs every decision Tbilisi makes. And it's not Iran, it's Russia. Georgia came out of the Soviet collapse in a worse position than almost any other post-Soviet state. Once one of the wealthiest Soviet republics, it emerged as one of the poorest and one of the most exposed. A weak democratic tradition, a fragile economy, and 2 breakaway regions backed by a far more powerful neighbor.
Я подписал указы о признании Российской Федерации независимости Южной Осетии и независимости Абхазии.
Then came 2008. In a 5-day war, Russia formally recognized the independence of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And it didn't stop at recognition. Under the banner of borderization, Russian forces kept pushing the administrative line outward, creeping forward until they were within reach of Georgia's Central Highway, the artery connecting the country's east to its west. That occupation has never ended. The Kremlin has never withdrawn its recognition of the breakaway regions, and Moscow has spent years since pressing other countries to recognize them too, a diplomatic campaign Georgia fights with a fraction of Russia's resources.
Потому что мы вместе победили в 45-м, вместе победили в августе 2008 года в Южной Осетии. И сегодня в зоне специальной военной операции российские и осетинские братья плечом к плечу отстаивают нашу общую историю.
Here's the critical point. Georgia's foreign policy has swung over the years, but its current answer to the permanent threat is what the government calls multi-vector. It isn't a push to join NATO in the West. That ambition has faded. It's diversification. Georgia tries to keep cordial, functional relations with Russia itself so as not to provoke the power occupying its land. At the same time, it deepens ties with Israel, Turkey, the Gulf, and China, and it has always courted the United States. The logic is simple. When no single partner can solve your Russia problem, you spread your bets and avoid depending on any one of them. Now here's where the ceiling comes from, and it has nothing to do with whether Iran and Russia get along. They mostly don't. They're transactional partners who diverge across the South Caucasus, and Iran even refused to recognize Georgia's breakaway regions, wary as a multi-ethnic state of setting a separatist precedent. The ceiling isn't about Tehran's friends, it's about where Georgia has placed its bets. Look at the partners Georgia actually values and is actively building on. Azerbaijan, its closest regional partner, its energy lifeline, and a state locked in its own long confrontation with Tehran. Israel, the source of defense and intelligence capabilities a small threatened country craves, and Iran's most committed enemy, the United States. Courted for 3 decades, nearly every relationship that matters to Tbilisi is with a state Iran counts as a rival. And those are precisely the relationships Iran cannot tolerate. Every step Georgia takes toward Baku, Jerusalem, or Washington reads in Tehran as a threat. So the closer Georgia gets to the partners it's actually invested in, the colder Iran necessarily becomes. Meanwhile, Iran offers Georgia very little in return. Some trade, some transit, nothing that touches Georgia's real problem. Warming to Tehran would mean cooling toward partners Georgia values far more in exchange for almost nothing. That's a trade it will never make. That's the ceiling. Not a shield against Russia, Georgia's own strategic bets, all of them pointing away from Tehran, held in place because the Russian threat that drives the whole multi-vector game never goes away. Let's go back to the beginning, because the pattern gets set almost immediately, and it's bounded from the start. When the Soviet Union collapsed and Georgia declared independence, one of the first governments to reach out wasn't in the West, it was Tehran. Iran sent one of the earliest official delegations and quickly recognized Georgian sovereignty. Why? Because Iran had its own problem, international isolation. And it looked at the map and saw Georgia as something valuable, a transit corridor, a route to Russia and the former socialist bloc, a way out of the box the West had built around it.
And then Iran had several times the attempts to leverage Georgia as a potential corridor to connect Russia, to connect the European Union. Back at that time, relations between Iran and Europe was not that bad as it is right now, and that's why they had this idea to use Georgia as a watergate corridor to export the energy, and not only energy, but some other commodities and products as well.
In April 1995, Iranian President Rafsanjani, one of the founding figures of the Islamic Republic, traveled to Georgia. And of all the things he could have asked to see, he asked the head of state, Edward Shevardnadze, to take him to the one place, the port of Poti, Georgia's maritime gateway, the sea outlet for the entire South Caucasus. That tells you exactly what Tehran wanted: access, connectivity, a corridor. What followed was active collaboration, memoranda opening much of Georgia's Soviet-era industrial base to Iranian participation. But there was one area of Iranian interest that alarmed Washington far more than ports and factories: nuclear physics. According to various sources, several Georgian physicists from the Sukhumi Institute of Physics and Technology worked on the Iranian nuclear program in the late 1990s. Georgia had inherited a serious Soviet scientific establishment, and Iran wanted in.
Так вот, работали на войну, на космос. Вот отправляли, когда ракету в воздух туда, вот этих, на космос. Отсюда от нас ехал туда человек, он там распитывался, что да, гарантию даем.
Washington moved hard. It pressured Shevardnadze to sever cooperation with Iran entirely and to hand over the names of the physicists involved. In exchange, the U.S. offered what Georgia needed most: help rebuilding the country. And here's the irony that frames everything after. The Iranian factor, Tehran's interest in Georgia, became one of the catalysts that pulled Georgia and the United States closer together. From the very start, the moment Iran leaned in, Georgia leaned toward Washington.
I reaffirmed in very strong terms America's support for the independence, the sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Georgia.
The relationship with Iran and the relationship with America were entangled from day one, and Georgia has almost always resolved that tension the same way. Out of that period came the arrangement that has defined things ever since: cold, friendly, limited engagement, built on a few understandings. Iran respects Georgia's territorial integrity, and Georgia stays out of anti-Iranian coalitions. Not warmth, not alliance, a functional, bounded coexistence between two countries with very different friends. Now, you might expect that as Georgia moved closer to the West and to Israel, the Iran relationship would collapse. It didn't. But, and this is the part the orbit narrative skips, it never got warm either. It stayed pinned in the same narrow band. The Rose Revolution in 2003 intensified Georgia's western turn and drew open hostility from Tehran. The Iran's leaders came to see Georgia's revolution as a warning, a template for exactly the kind of western-backed change the regime feared at home. We know how much it rattled them because Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei said it out loud.
Iranians were so much afraid that it might repeat in Iran, and they were quite close to repeat the same scenario in Iran in 2029. And even Khamenei once said that, some stupids thought that Iran was like a Georgia. And it was his official quotation.
Georgia had become a cautionary tale inside the regime's own head. On top of that, Tehran was deeply suspicious of Georgia's ties to Israel, fearing Georgian territory could become a platform to collect intelligence on Iran or even to stage strikes against it. That suspicion focused on Georgian-Israeli defense cooperation, which deepened during the tenure of Defense Minister David Kezerashvili, a Georgian Jew with Israeli citizenship, between 2006 and 2008. In Tehran's telling, and I want to be precise, this is the Iranian narrative, not established fact, Israel gained access to 2 former Soviet air bases in southern Georgia and used them to surveil Iran. So, a revolution Iran hated, alliances Iran feared, surely the relationship broke. But it didn't. Look closely at what didn't break actually means. Georgia never once traded away its ties to Israel or its courtship of Washington to make Tehran feel more comfortable. It couldn't, and it didn't want to. Those were the relationships it valued, the ones that it was building its future on. Iran had nothing to put on the other side of the table. That's why cold friendly held at a low, stable temperature for 2 decades. Not because the two sides were drifting together, but because Georgia's real bets were all pointed elsewhere, and both sides knew it. You can even see it in the cooperation that continued through the hostility. The 2006 winter gas shipments came under Ahmadinejad, one of Iran's most confrontational governments, to a country moving firmly into the Western camp. Transactional, bounded, never more. Here's the strongest evidence against the orbit story. Every time it actually mattered, Georgia came down on Iran's opposite side. The openness that kept Georgia's options alive also created openings Iran was happy to exploit, and Georgia repeatedly shut them down. Start with 2008.
How are you, Lee?
How are you doing?
Nice to see you.
Good to see you again, sir. Congratulations to you. Morning.
After the war with Russia, Georgia was diplomatically battered and desperate for American support, in no position to resist American pressure. So, when Washington wanted it, Tbilisi extradited an Iranian national, Amir Hossein Ardebili, to the United States. When the case became public in 2009, it ruptured relations with Tehran so badly that a Georgian embassy staff were reportedly evacuated from Iran. The relationship didn't recover until 2011, when Georgia introduced visa-free travel for Iranians. For an isolated Georgia, that was a real economic gain. But the same open door let in more than tourists. As early as 2011, a group of Iranian businessmen, Pouria Nayebi, Hoshang Hossein-Pour, and Hoshang Farzadeh, all 3 later sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury in 2014, built an extensive commercial network inside Georgia designed to help Tehran evade Western sanctions. Georgia had become a convenient gateway around the very sanctions regime its Western partners were enforcing. And it wasn't just money, it was operations. The bomb under the Israeli embassy car in 2012, the foiled IRGC assassination plot in 2022, which by some reporting wasn't even Tehran's first attempt on that same man's life. There's a quieter dimension too, a sustained Iranian soft power campaign aimed at Georgia's ethnic Azerbaijani Shia minority, promoting Tehran's brand of state-sponsored Shia theology, influence reaching past commerce into identity and belief. Tehran has built real institutional infrastructure for this, especially in Marneuli and Kmemo-Kartli, the heart of Georgia's Azerbaijani community. At its center is Al Mustafa International University, an arm of Qom-based seminary network that the U.S. Treasury has sanctioned for its role in the recruitment on behalf of the IRGC, which runs campuses in several Georgian towns with large ethnic Azerbaijani populations. Around it sits a wider web of Iran-linked religious and charitable organizations, some tied to the Iranian embassy in Tbilisi, pushing an Iranian-aligned Shiism alongside anti-Western and pro-Russian narratives.
Georgia is the only country in the world where Iran can use its religious soft power and promote the values of the Islamic Republic among the citizens of Georgia, because in other countries, for example, in Lebanon or in Iraq, etc., Iran use hard power, military force, military power, okay? It's different.
And this hasn't gone unnoticed at the highest levels of Georgian politics. In late 2025, Georgia's imprisoned former president Mikhail Saakashvili, the man who spent his presidency trying to integrate this very community, wrote an anguished Facebook post warning that Iran had made dangerous inroads among Georgian and Azerbaijanis. He described young people in Marneuli carrying portraits of Ayatollah Khamenei. He pointed to residents of the region detained across Europe on suspicion of spying for Iran. The most recent, he said, arrested in Greece just days earlier. And he claimed the current government had allowed Iranian intelligence and Iran-linked Islamists to expand their reach in the community. Now, Saakashvili is a polarizing figure with his own agenda, and some of his claims about recruitment go well beyond what's been proven. But the underlying pattern he's describing is real and documented. And here's the tell that should stop the Orbit crowd in its tracks. The country most alarmed by all this isn't in the West, it's Azerbaijan. For years, Baku has been sounding the alarm about Iranian religious penetration of the ethnic Azerbaijani community across the border in its media and in private channels with Tbilisi. And it hasn't just talked.
The secular government of Azerbaijan has been worried of Iran's influence among its citizens and the propagation activities of Iranian mullahs is prohibited in Azerbaijan. Such obstacle is much less visible in Georgia.
Every one of these pro-Iranian organizations operating freely in Georgia is outright banned in Azerbaijan. And when al-Mustafa tried to open on Azerbaijani soil, Baku blocked it. So Georgia's single closest regional partner treats the exact networks flourishing in Marneuli as a threat to be outlawed. That tells you these aren't the seeds of some Georgian embrace of Tehran. They're a liability Georgia's own best friend has been warning about it for years. For Tehran, that's the payoff of decades of outreach. A constituency inside Georgia that can be mobilized around Iranian causes. Just this year, after the opening strikes on Iran, several hundred Georgian Azerbaijanis gathered outside the Iranian embassy in Tbilisi holding portraits of Khamenei, a scene that would have been unthinkable in the Georgia of 15 years ago. So Iranian influence in Georgia is real. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and neither does the analysis this video is based on. But watch what Georgia did with it. By 2013, with the Georgian Dream Party newly in power, Washington's Treasury Department was seeing the hallmarks of money laundering and sanctions circumvention on Georgian soil. A joint U.S.-Georgian effort followed. Iranian-linked entities, a bank and airline, were shut down. Tbilisi reinstated visa requirements for Iranians for about 2 years. The same happened under Trump's maximum pressure campaign. Georgia informally lined up with the sanctions, banks barred Iranian accounts, residency permits dried up, Iran's parliament publicly slammed Tbilisi for it.
In any critical moments, whether it was during the Shevardnadze time or Misha or the current governments, when Georgia faced the dilemma between have good relations, like war relations with Iran or strategic partnership with the West, they always go for the West. Because the West is the only country, the only power which can balance the Kremlin threats. And Georgia has no choice but to be somehow attached to the West.
This is the pattern the Orbit narrative can't account for. When Washington pushed, Georgia complied and absorbed the cost with Tehran. Every time. Then, when the pressure eased and Georgia's own economic needs reasserted, the ties quietly recovered, but only back to the ceiling, never through it. Pressure, concessions, recovery, never capture. A country sliding into Iran's orbit does not spend 2 decades dismantling Iranian networks the moment its partners ask. Which brings us to the present, and to what the recent alarm actually gets wrong. First, let's be fair to it, because part of it is true. The Georgian Dream government has drifted sharply away from the West. Relations with Washington and Brussels have deteriorated badly, and into that gap has stepped more visible engagement with Tehran. In 2024, Prime Minister Irakli Kopakhidze traveled to Iran twice, for President Raisi's funeral in May and for President Pezeshkian's inauguration in July. A head of government attending a neighbor's state funeral is, on its own, unremarkable. But the timing was the message. Those trips came exactly as Tbilisi's relations with the United States and the EU were falling apart. So here comes the alarm. A Hudson Institute study documents Iran's growing influence in Georgia. The Washington Post runs an op-ed warning that a former U.S. ally is slipping into Tehran's orbit. Persian language outlets amplify it, and the through line of all of it is a single claim. Georgia is drifting into Iran's arms. Here's the problem with that claim. It confuses two completely different things, cooling toward the West and warming toward Iran. Those aren't the same move. Georgia's drift from Washington is real, but its multi-vector turn didn't send it into Tehran's arms, it sent Georgia toward Israel, Turkey, the Gulf, and China, and toward keeping Russia itself functional. Iran is not one of the vectors Georgia is building on. It's the one relationship every other vector pushes against. And you can prove it with what Georgia was doing at the very same moment it was warming to Iran, deepening its ties with Israel. In August 2025, Israel's National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir traveled to Tbilisi for law enforcement and counterterrorism talks. 2 months later, Georgia's Interior Minister reciprocated with a trip to Israel, and the two sides signed a memorandum formalizing security cooperation. Sit with that. A country supposedly falling into Iran's orbit was simultaneously signing security agreements with Iran's single most committed adversary. That is not the behavior of a satellite. That is a country running a genuine multi-vector policy. And even Iran's own state-aligned media saw it that way. And that is the ceiling made visible. Because for all of Georgia's balancing, one thing never changes. Every visible step closer to Israel is read in Tehran as a direct provocation. Georgia keeps taking those steps anyway. The Multi-Vector Act has a hard limit, and Iran, not Georgia, is the one who keeps running into it. And then the ground shifted in a way that makes orbit narrative even harder to sustain. The US-Iran war changed what Iran is. Over the course of the Gulf War, Tehran demonstrated something the region hadn't fully seen before: the ability to reach out and strike US-aligned states across the Middle East with missiles and drones, causing real infrastructural and financial damage. And even after a ceasefire took hold, Iran kept targeting neighboring US-aligned states and kept issuing a warning. Others risked sharing their fate. That warning was delivered inside Georgia itself. Iran's ambassador in Tbilisi, Saeed Ali Mujani, echoed exactly that message, and it triggered such a sharp public backlash that his Facebook page briefly went dark amid controversy. Think about what that means for the drift thesis. A foreign ambassador in the Georgian capital publicly signaling that small states seen as enabling Washington are now legitimate pressure points. You do not slide into the orbit of a regime that's openly menacing you in your own capital. None of this means Iran is without cards. The religious networks we talked about, the mobilizable constituency inside Georgia's Azerbaijani Shia community, are exactly the kind of lever Tehran keeps in reserve, one that operates below the level of the state and doesn't depend on what Tbilisi wants. But a lever is not a leash. Iran retaining a channel of influence is a very different thing from Georgia sliding into its orbit. And conflating the two is the core mistake. And here's the counterintuitive turn Khalidzi draws out. The war didn't pull Georgia toward Iran. It made getting close to Iran even more unthinkable, while simultaneously making a clean break more dangerous. Iran went from a difficult neighbor to a demonstrated regional striker. That raises the value Tbilisi places on cold-friendly equilibrium, the careful, bounded, arm's-length distance, precisely because the cost of getting the balance wrong just went up. Georgia now has more reason than ever to keep Iran cold and more reason than ever not to make it an open enemy. So the alarm gets it backwards. And understanding why matters, because Washington is about to make a related mistake.
ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების საელჩო თბილისში სახელმწიფო დეპარტამენტის დელეგაციის საქართველოს
In late May, a U.S. State Department delegation came to Tbilisi for senior talks, raising hopes of a genuine reset in U.S.-Georgia relations. The instinct behind such a reset is often to demand that Tbilisi downgrade its ties with Tehran as the price of readmission. That demand rests on the same misreading. It treats Georgia's relationship with Iran as a choice Georgia is freely making, a drift that can simply be reversed with enough pressure. But it was never a free choice. It's the residue of a security environment that hasn't moved in 30 years. Russian occupation, contested territory, and a country too exposed to make enemies it doesn't have to. History tells us exactly how Georgia answers that kind of demand. It complies. but only as far as its security margin allows. And then, the moment the pressure lifts, it recalibrates back to the ceiling. 3 decades, 3 governments, one unbroken pattern. Because the thing driving it, Georgia's exposure to Russia, has never changed. So here's the correction, and it cuts against both the alarmists and the reset builders. Georgia is not falling into Iran's orbit. It can't, because everything Georgia values and is investing in points the other way, and Georgia keeps proving it every time it signs an agreement with Israel or shuts down an Iranian network. But Georgia also can't be bullied into cleanly breaking with Tehran, because as a small, Russia-threatened state, now facing a neighbor that has shown it will strike, it can't afford to turn a difficult relationship into an active war. Both camps misread a bounded, structural equilibrium as a moving trajectory. The alarmists watch Georgia refuse to break with Iran and cry orbit. Pressure campaigners want to force that break from the other side. Neither sees that the band itself is fixed, a ceiling set by Georgia's own strategic bets, all pointed away from Tehran, and a floor set by Iran's reach and Georgia's vulnerability. That's the lesson Kaladze draws for Washington, and it's concrete. If the U.S. genuinely wants Georgia, corridor security, better governance, resilience against Russian influence, the durable version of that relationship separates those real interests from a demand for anti-Iranian alignment. Tie the reset to breaking with Tehran, and you're asking Georgia to take on retaliatory risk at the exact moment that the risk is highest, and setting the whole thing up to run the same short cycle it always has. Georgia can never get close to Iran. It's structurally incapable of it, and the headlines warning otherwise have mistaken a low, stable ceiling for a slide. The real question was never whether Georgia likes Iran. It's whether Washington can finally tell the difference between a country drifting away from it and a country falling into someone else's arms. They are not the same thing, and confusing them is exactly how you turn the first into the second. Thanks for watching. This video is based on an analysis by Bako Kaladze with the Turan Research Center. If you found this video informative, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. And let me know in the comments, is the Georgia is slipping into Iran's orbit narrative overblown, the way this analysis argues? Or is the Iranian influence in Tbilisi something Washington can't afford to shrug off?